Imagine a trench, not just any trench, a muddy, corpse-choked gully, barely wider than a grave. Now imagine it rained for 24 hours straight. Imagine the mud isn't just earth, it's mixed with blood. Imagine the air isn't air. It's thick with gunpowder smoke and the screams of men driven beyond sanity. This wasn't just a battle. It was a descent into hell on earth. May 12, 1864. Spotsylvania Courthouse, Virginia, the place they called the Mule Shoe. For over 24 unrelenting hours, 15,000 Union soldiers hurled themselves against the heart of Robert E. Lee's defenses. What followed defied description. Soldiers fired until their muskets glowed. They fought not with tactics, but with rifle butts, bayonets, rocks, and bare hands. Bodies piled 4, 5 deep. Men drowned in mud mixed with the viscera of their comrades. The rain washed away the landscape, leaving only a charnel house where nothing grew back. Survivors tried to write it down, to make sense of it. Most found the words failed them. The horror was unimaginable. This was the American Civil War, ripped raw, stripped of glory, reduced to its most primal, brutal essence. This was carnage on an industrial scale, fought in the mud with muzzle loaders. How did it start? What drove Grant to keep attacking? What fatal mistake did Lee make? And what did this single horrific day at the Mule Shoe do to the men who survived it, and the fate of a nation tearing itself apart? This is the story of the day the earth ran red. But before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel to support our community. On May 8, 1864, Union forces, led by Ulysses S. Grant and George Meade, launched an offensive against the Confederate Army under Robert E. Lee, known as the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. In this second major engagement, Grant and Meade committed substantial resources aiming to crush or outflank the Confederate defenders of Richmond, Virginia. Following the recent Battle of the Wilderness, both Union and Confederate armies were weary and disorganized. Nevertheless, Ulysses S. Grant pressed forward relentlessly. His objective was to seize the Spotsylvania crossroads, positioning his army between Robert E. Lee's forces and Richmond. However, the skilled Confederate commander, General Robert E. Lee, foresaw this maneuver and reacted swiftly. On May 8th, the large cavalry forces of both armies engaged in prolonged and complex fighting. The distinctive character of Confederate General J.E.B. Stuart, combined with friction within the Union High Command, caused the cavalry combat front to widen significantly, soon resulting in heavy Union numerical losses. A notable event was the mortal wounding of General Stuart on May 11th. His subsequent absence from command would severely burden the Confederate cavalry's leadership structure for the remainder of the war. As these fierce cavalry clashes unfolded, Lee directed his infantry to construct an extensive line of field fortifications, roughly 4 miles, 6.5 kilometers, long, north of Spotsylvania. Its primary vulnerability was a pronounced bulge known as the Mule Shoe. Over subsequent days, constant preliminary skirmishes delayed a major assault, until Union forces launched a fierce initiative against Confederates who were still fortifying their defensive positions. The Union attack on the Mule Shoe salient commenced on May 10th, marking a significant engagement. This can aptly be described as a determined infantry charge that breached the enemy defenses. Yet Union soldiers were ultimately repulsed by Confederate counterattacks by day's end. However, the sheer scale and broad fronts involved in these battles produced the bloodiest phase of the confrontation. On May 11th, as General Grant repositioned his forces for another major assault, General Lee misinterpreted the Union activity. Confident in his hitherto successful defensive actions and the high casualty toll suffered by Union troops, the Southern commander consequently withdrew artillery to counter a potential flanking move. This decision set the stage for the horrific day to follow. Meanwhile, Union troops massed in great strength for a decisive attack. Consequently, General Grant's massive assault on May 12th initially achieved total success, rupturing the Confederate lines before Lee could rush reinforcements to seal the gap. Lee's leadership averted what could have been a catastrophic breakthrough, but henceforth neither side yielded any ground without fighting to the death. From the early hours of May 12th, torrential rains drenched much of the Union powder and a significant portion of the Confederates, causing initial firefights to be brief and rapidly devolving into savage hand-to-hand combat. The combat's most savage phase occurred when 15,000 infantrymen of Hancock's Tour Corps collided along a front roughly half a mile wide. The Muleshoe's defenses swiftly dissolved into chaos, degenerating into little more than an armed throng. Beginning in the pre-dawn hours of May 12th, the struggle persisted until the early morning of May 13th. Effectively, it spanned over 24 hours. Torrential rain throughout the day rendered the terrain even more nightmarish. The engagement featured unprecedented firepower intensity for the Civil War, flattening the entire landscape and obliterating all foliage. A frenzied bloodbath ensued, with both sides locked in seesaw trench fighting over corpse-choked earth for endless hours. Armed with muzzle-loading muskets, adversaries were repeatedly driven to brutal hand-to-hand combat, reminiscent of ancient warfare. Bodies stacked 4 or 5 deep, compelling soldiers to intermittently halt and hurl corpses over parapets to clear fighting space. The slain and injured were struck so repeatedly that many were simply blown apart into unrecognizable mounds of flesh. Survivors attempting to capture the day's hellish ferocity in letters, diaries, and memoirs often found it inexpressible. Or, as one account relates, nothing could convey the pandemonium, the savage and eerie shrieks, the murderous visages, the terrible oaths, and the appalling dread of the tumult. Certain soldiers reported discharging upwards of 400 rounds that day, widely regarded as one of the conflict's most primal and unrestrained encounters. By the morning of May 13th, Robert E. Lee's troops finished a secondary trench line and withdrew into it, yielding ground to Grant's forces. Attacks by the Union and Confederate defenses resumed in subsequent days. Subsequent engagements never matched the ferocity of May 12th. A major Union assault against Confederate positions on May 18th encountered intense artillery bombardment and yielded no decisive outcome. The Harris Farm episode signaled the battle was concluding. Military movements persisted until May 21st, when preparations commenced for the 9-month siege of Petersburg. Total casualties at Spotsylvania were estimated at 32,000 for both armies. This stood as the costliest engagement of the Overland Campaign and ranked third among the Civil War's 5 bloodiest battles. While both sides declared victory, the conflict is generally considered advantageous to the Confederates as they halted the Union's immediate advance. Yet it must be noted that personnel losses, competent generals, and veteran soldiers proved irreplaceable for Robert E. Lee's army. The South grew increasingly exhausted, and the war would still claim thousands more lives. Silence finally fell over the Muleshoe. The unrelenting rain washed over a landscape utterly transformed. What was once forest and field was now a churned, corpse-strewn bog. Grant would push south, his grim resolve unbroken. Lee had held the crossroads, but at what hidden cost? 32,000 casualties, a river of American blood soaking Virginia soil. For 24 brutal hours, men fought not just an enemy, but the mud, the rain, the suffocating horror. Lee claimed victory. He stopped Grant's advance here, yet his army was gutted. Jeb Stuart was gone. Irreplaceable veterans lay in that mud. Was this a tactical triumph, or the Confederacy's fatal hemorrhage? Grant saw relentless pressure as the path to victory. But the Muleshoe asks a harder question. Could such carnage ever be justified? Survivors struggled for words. One called it simply the angle, the bloody angle. A place where valor met savagery, where muskets fell silent, and men killed with rocks, bayonets, and bare hands in trenches choked with the dead. The Overland Campaign ground on. Petersburg awaited. But Spotsylvania, and especially the Muleshoe, stands apart, not just for the scale of slaughter, but but for its primal industrial ferocity. It stripped war bare. Lee held the field that May. But was the South's lifeblood draining away into the mud of the bloody angle? The earth ran red. A nation reeled. The echoes of that unimaginable day still ask us the hardest questions about war, sacrifice, and the terrible price of victory. What do you hear in that silence?